إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله فاللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا أما بعد يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون وبعد. My brothers and sisters in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us in the verse that I have recited before to have the taqwa of Allah as is rightfully due to Allah and to not die except as Muslims. Today, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, we will talk about a concept which is the concept of ash-shakwa, the concept of complaining. And this concept is a good concept if done correctly, and of course a bad concept if done incorrectly. What do we mean by this? If a person does this shakwa to Allah Azza wa Jal alone, this is a very good thing. And in fact, Allah Azza wa Jal loves it, and He, subhanallah, commends the prophets and the many righteous people who have done this to Allah alone. And He, Allah Azza wa Jal, does not like it when the person does it to a fellow human being. And there are certain cases when it is allowed to do it to a fellow human being. And inshallah, this khutbah will be an exploration of all of these concepts, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Allah Azza wa Jal quotes Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam, the father of Yusuf, in Surat Yusuf, in which he says, إِنَّمَا أَشْكُو بَثِّي وَحُزْنِي إِلَى اللَّهِ. Indeed, I only complain my bath and my huzn to Allah Azza wa Jal. And this, of course, happened after the sons of Yaqub, Yusuf's brothers. They saw that their father was very saddened by what had taken place, by their brother, the youngest brother, being left in Egypt, and so on and so forth. And they asked him, why are you weeping? Why are you crying? Why are you showing this sadness? Because indeed, it will lead to you being amongst al-halikin, the people who will be perished. It will perhaps lead to your death. And of course, his sadness caused his eyes to become blind. So he says, إِنَّمَا أَشْكُو بَثِّي وَحُزْنِي إِلَى اللَّهِ. He says, indeed, I only complain to Allah Azza wa Jal, my sadness that I feel. And they said that the word bath, the word huzn, we all understand as sadness. But the word bath, Allah Azza wa Jal uses it. As Imam al-Qurtubi rahimahullah, he says in his tafsir that the word bath is anything external that the human being really has no control over showing. Meaning people will be able to see that you are sad without you even saying a word. And you have no control over showing the sadness. This just comes out. There is no control over many of our human emotions. We cannot hide it. Subhanallah, a lot of times we are walking windows to what's going on in ourselves. And people will be able to see this. And this is why this type of sadness is called al-bath, because it's everything external. And so they saw us upon him. Al-huzn is anything internal, meaning everything that is going on inside and so on and so forth. And he says, I am only complaining to Allah, وَأَعْلَمُ مِنَ اللَّهِ مَا لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. And he says, of course, at the end, that I know from Allah what you do not know, meaning that he knew that Allah Azza wa Jal was going to establish Yusuf's dream. Remember in the beginning of the surah, Yusuf saw a dream and he says that I know that Allah will establish this, yet I am saddened because of the distance that happened between me and my sons, and how shaitan came in between my sons and has caused this enmity and this division amongst them. This is how one prophet of Allah Azza wa Jal complained to Allah. And Allah knew this, and Allah Azza wa Jal, of course, fulfilled the promise that was seen by Yusuf. He fulfilled the promise that eventually they'll be reunited. He fulfilled the promise that eventually Yaqub will find his son, will be with his son, and not only be with him, but be able to see him as well, where Allah Azza wa Jal brought back his eyesight. Many of the prophets, a person would say that Allah Azza wa Jal already knows what's wrong with them. Meaning, for example, when Prophet Nuh alayhi salam was going through his problem with his people, Allah Azza wa Jal, it could be argued that Allah already knows what's going on with the people, what's between him and these people that he is, subhanAllah, calling to the path of Allah Azza wa Jal. Yet despite this, all of them called to Allah. And the answer to this is very simple, in the sense that one of the scholars of Islam, he was asked, كيف تشتكي إِلَيْهِ مَا لَا يَخْفَى عَلَيْهِ. How do you complain to Allah what is not hidden from Allah? Meaning Allah already knows. And so the scholar, he says, قَالَ رَبِّ يَرْضَى ذُلَّ الْعَبْدِ إِلَيْهِ. That indeed my Lord is pleased with the humility that His servant shows in front of Him. That indeed in the end, the idea is not necessarily complaining and explaining in detail what is going on. Rather, the idea is humbling ourselves in front of the one who in His hand is the solution for what we face. Whatever calamity we face, we have to understand that in Allah's hand is the only solution. And Allah Azza wa Jal, if He says for something to be, it will be. Whatever that situation is, if a person is sick and Allah Azza wa Jal has decreed that this person will die, khalas, he will die. لا رَدَّ لِقَضَائِهِ. There is nothing that will turn back Allah Azza wa Jal's divine decree. And this is why when Nuh alayhi salam, like we said before, he says, قَالَ رَبِّ إِنِّي مَغْلُوبٌ فَانْتَصِرْ. He says, oh my Lord, I am maghloob, I am defeated, so please bring victory for me. فَدَعَ رَبَّهُ أَنِّي مَغْلُوبٌ فَانْتَصِرْ. Allah Azza wa Jal answers, فَفَتَحْنَا أَبْوَابَ السَّمَاءِ بِمَاءٍ مُنْهَمِرٍ. So we open the doors of the heaven with this rain that will come down. And of course we know the rest of the story. Each prophet of Allah Azza wa Jal, in fact, it extends not only to the prophets. If you look Prophet Ayyub alayhi salam, where he says, أَنِّي مَسْيَنَا الضُّرُّ وَأَنْتَ أَرْحَمُ الرَّاحِمِينَ. That, oh Allah, harm has touched me. And many different scholars have said what this harm actually was. That subhanAllah, he was not complaining. This harm that he faced, most of them agree that the harm that he was complaining from was not the sickness or the disease. It was rather that people started to leave Islam. They started to leave Iman after they saw what had afflicted him. And this caused him more harm for him than his physical, subhanAllah, ailment that happened to him. And the death of his wife and the death of his children and all these other things. And so when he says, أَنِّي رَبِّي يَمَسَّنِي الضُّرُّ, that he was talking about how people started to leave Islam. Because they said, the people, he said that he had over 40 students. And they said by this time, almost every single one of them had left. They no longer learned from him and they no longer believed in Allah Azza wa Jal. And all of them were saying that if this person was truly a prophet from Allah, Allah would not treat him like this. Allah would be more generous to him because this is a prophet. How could Allah let this happen to a prophet? This is what they said, and it caused them to disbelieve. And this is when he said, أَنِّي مَسْيَنِيَ الضُّرُّ. That this is when harm had afflicted me, because my cause, my whole job for calling to Allah now is being, of course, taken away. And after this, of course, in front of a few of his students, they said that this is what happened, where he says, اضرب برجلك. He says, strike with your leg. هذا مغتسل بارد وشراب. That indeed you will wash yourself, you will cleanse yourself, you will come back. And when they saw the miracle performed, this is when they believed, and they told everyone else, and they believed. And Allah Azza wa Jal replaced his children. They said that in some narrations he had over 7 sons and 7 daughters, and Allah replaced them double what he had before. And Allah Azza wa Jal doubled what he had before from wealth, etc., because of his patience. But he complained to Allah Azza wa Jal alone. He did never complain to one of the people. And in fact, when he did complain to Allah, he only complained to Allah Azza wa Jal for the people not believing, not for the materialistic or the worldly needs. This does not, of course, negate that a person cannot complain to Allah Azza wa Jal for worldly needs. In fact, He is the one that we need to turn to and not turn to anyone else. If we look at the people, the Ashab al-Kahf, the youth that went into the cave, they also only complained to Allah Azza wa Jal. And Allah Azza wa Jal was the only one, of course, who could help them, as we know in the story. Yunus alayhi salam, prophet after prophet. وَنَادَى فِي الظُّلُمَاتِ أَنْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا أَنْتَ سُبْحَانَكَ إِنِّي كُنْتُ مِنَ الظَّالِمِينَ. He called out in the darkness that there is no God worthy of worship except you. Indeed, I was one of the wrongdoers. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَاسْتَجَبْنَا لَهُ وَنَجَّيْنَاهُ مِنَ الْغَمِّ وَكَذَلِكَ نُنْجِي الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. He says, we answered his call. And we relieved him from al-gham, from this despair that he was in. SubhanAllah, he describes this al-gham is more of a psychological harm than it is physical. Because we know in Islam that the psychological harm perhaps is worse than the physical. And the mental, the spiritual harm that a person faces is perhaps worse. All of these people turn to Allah alone. And this is one of the essences of Tawheed. That when we are faced with a calamity, when we are faced with a dilemma, we only call upon Allah Azza wa Jal alone and not anyone else. If we truly believe that Allah is alone and He has no partners. We do not go neither to a human being, we do not go to an angel, we do not go to an idol, we do not go to a human being whether he is alive or he is dead. We only call upon Allah Azza wa Jal alone when we are in need of help. And this is why our shakwa, our calling, our complaints should be always for Allah Azza wa Jal alone. If we look, even our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam sets a beautiful example. When he was, of course, expelled from Ta'if, and the people of Ta'if belied him, and he makes this dua. And of course, some of the scholars of Ahadith have said that this has some weakness, but many, the scholars, even Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah, he uses this, وَيَسْتَشْهِدُ بِهَا, he uses this to make many lessons from this. And he says the beautiful one where he says, اللهم إني أشكو إليك ضعف قوتي وقلة حيلتي وهواني على الناس. Oh Allah, I complain to you the weakness of my strength and how little planning I have or plotting I have. And how, subhanAllah, unimportant I am in front of all of these people. And he continues on with his dua that he calls upon Allah Azza wa Jal, and then he seeks refuge in Allah and in the light of Allah Azza wa Jal from everything that he's facing. In fact, from one of the Sahaba, when he complained, he only complained to Allah Azza wa Jal. Khubayb, when he was taken by the kuffar as a prisoner of war, and they took him and they wanted to take revenge on him for what happened to the relatives in the battle of Badr. And they were going to crucify him. And they took him outside of Mecca. And then he says to them, Khubayb, and of course this hadith is narrated by one of the Sahaba. At the time this person was not a Sahabi, but he was thinking about accepting Islam. And later of course he accepted Islam. But at the time when he saw this, he almost became Muslim because of what he saw. Khubayb says, for these mushrikeen, he tells them, can you leave me to just pray arka rak'atani, to pray 2 rak'ahs before you guys kill me? I just want to pray 2 rak'ahs. They said, sure, fine. It's not going to help you. And of course he wants to let them know it's not about it helping me or not. He wants to pray to Allah Azza wa Jal. And so, the Sahabi narrating, of course, he says that he made 2 rak'ahs perfect. And he prayed to Allah Azza wa Jal. And after he finished, he stands up and he looks at all of the people and he says, أما والله لولا أن تظنوا أني إنما طولت جزعا من القتل لاستكثرت من الصلاة. He says that if it weren't for the fact that you would have thought that I was afraid of death, I would have made my salah longer. But I shortened it in order for you to not think that. To not think that I am afraid of death. And then he says, the narrators, of course, of the hadith, كان خبيب أول من سن هاتين الركعتين قبل القتل عند المسلمين. So of course, they lifted him, they tied him up. So then he starts making dua. اللهم إنا قد بلغنا رسالة رسولك فبلغه الغداة بما يصنع بنا. He says, oh Allah, we have conveyed the message of your messenger. So please let him know what is being happening to us. And the Prophet ﷺ was told indeed, through wahi, what indeed was happening to him. And then of course he makes dua against every single person who plotted against himself. And he says, Allahumma ahsihim adada waqtulhum badada wa la tughadir minhum ahada. He says, oh Allah, take your revenge basically upon these people. And do not leave anyone from amongst these people who have taken my life, get away. And then when they started torturing him, they did not kill him immediately. When they started torturing him, during the torture process, the Sahabi says that when I saw, subhanAllah, half his body basically hanging out of himself, the person was still alive. And so they asked him, أَتَوَدُّ أَنَّ مُحَمَّدًا مَكَانَكَ? Would you like to be saved and that Muhammad is in your place? He says, Wallahi, I would not be with my family content if the Prophet ﷺ is being pricked with one thorn. I wouldn't allow it to happen. And I would put myself in front of any harm rather than the Prophet ﷺ. He says, I would rather sacrifice myself for him. And of course this shows the dedication and the love that many of the Sahaba had for the Prophet ﷺ. This shows that this man, when he prayed his 2 rak'ahs, he was of course complaining to Allah alone and not to anyone else. And this is why when the woman came to the Prophet ﷺ and she was complaining against her husband. Her husband, we know, was unjust to her and he wronged her. And so she came to the Prophet ﷺ to explain her situation. From this story, there are a few rules that we can now identify in the etiquette of complaining. That when we go to a specialist in whatever field, so here she came in the in the area of religion, she goes to the Prophet ﷺ, to the scholar, to the person who actually knows how to answer her call. And she goes and she explains her situation. This is not shakwa li ghayrillah. Because indeed Allah Azza wa Jal said, قَدْ سَمِعَ اللَّهُ قَوْلَ الَّتِي تُجَادِلُكَ فِي زَوْجِهَا وَتَشْتَكِي إِلَى اللَّهِ. It says, indeed Allah has heard the words of the woman who comes to you complaining about her husband, but she complains to Allah. Meaning that if the person has to go to another human being, which is inevitable, you will face a calamity in which you will have to go to another human being who has the solution for your problem. But if you understand and you put your trust and faith in Allah Azza wa Jal that only He has the solution for your problem, you can go to the specialist. As long as you fully understand and fully comprehend that the solution is always in the hands of Allah, but that He might have also given it to this human being for him to facilitate for you. Because we know well that our rizq, our sustenance is from Allah Azza wa Jal alone. Yet a lot of times He might give it to a wealthy person who opens a business, who hires me as an employee, and then I get my sustenance through him. But that does not negate the fact that I know that Allah Azza wa Jal is the one who aslan provided it for everyone, and that He facilitates my sustenance through an individual or through a business or through whatever it is that I do as a profession. And similarly, when I need help in any calamity or any situation that I come with, I go to the specialist, but I fully understand that Allah Azza wa Jal is the one who in His hand is the solution. So when this woman goes to the Prophet ﷺ, Allah tells her and tells him in this verse that is recited until the Day of Judgment about her situation, that she is complaining to Allah alone. Because she never went to the Prophet ﷺ thinking that he had the solution. In fact, in one of the narrations, when the Prophet ﷺ told her, I don't have an answer for you. Because at the time there was no Quran about her problem. Because the person says, he did dhihar, which is he swore that she is like his own mother to him. Meaning he will not have relations with her like a husband has with his wife. Even though both of them were old in age and so on and so forth. This word in the Jahiliyyah used to be a word of talaq, of divorce. But in Islam, they didn't know whether it was still a word of talaq or not. And so when she came to the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet said, I don't have anything from this. She's like, how come you don't have anything from this? I'm coming to you. He says, I don't have an answer yet. If you wait, there might be an answer. And then she says, I am complaining to Allah alone. I don't need the human being. And then of course Allah Azza wa Jal sends down these verses in which we will recite until the Day of Judgment about her situation. Which is why Umar radiallahu anhu, when he met her one day in the road, when he was Amir al-Mu'mineen, she talked to him. And many of the people around Umar, they said, Umar, come on, we need to go, we're late. What are you doing? He says, Wallahi, if this woman talked to me from early in the morning until late in the evening, I would still listen to her, because this is the woman who Allah listened to. When Allah says, قَدْ سَمِعَ اللَّهُ قَوْلَ الَّتِي تُجَادِلُكَ. And He says He listened to her and she was telling him basically to fear Allah. She says, in the Jahiliyyah, ya Umar, you used to be called Umair. And then when you became a Muslim, we called you Umar. And then now we call you Amir al-Mu'mineen. She said, don't let that get to your mind. Don't let that fool you to think that you are anything better than anyone else. Rather, you should fear Allah just like anyone else. And she of course reminded him and commended him for all of his work. May Allah Azza wa Jal help us and guide us to this. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الخلق وأشرف المرسلين سيدنا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. Speaking about Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, where he says ما في الشكوى إلى الخلق إلا أن تحزن صديقك أو تشمت عدوك. He says that there is nothing in the complaining to the people except that two things will happen. Either you make your friend sad because of your own sadness, or you make your enemy happy. Because your enemy, of course, will always be happy to your despair. And this is why Al-Ahnaf, one of the tabi'een, he says that شَكَوْتُ إِلَى عَمِّي مَا أَجْدُ فِي بَطْنِي. He says, I complained to my uncle what I found in my stomach. He had some sort of sickness. And so his uncle told him, يَبْنَ أَخِي لَا تَشْكُ إِلَى أَحَدٍ مَا نَزَلَ بِكَ. Do not complain to anyone what befalls you. فَإِنَّمَا النَّاسُ رَجُلَانِ رَجُلٌ تَسُوءُهُ بهذه الشكوى وتؤلمه وعدو تسره بهذه الشكوى. He says, do not complain to anyone what you find, because the people are of two types. Either a friend that you will of course sadden because of what you say, or an enemy that you will make happy because of what you say as well. Worse than this is not only the person who complains about what he finds, but he actually in essence is complaining about Allah to the people. And let's explain this for a little bit, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Because many times people complain about the qadr that they find, right, in their lives. They complain about what Allah Azza wa Jal has already decreed in a fashion that makes it seem like they are complaining against Allah's judgment. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. And they are subsequently complaining about Allah to the people. And this is of course the worst of the worst. Because, and Ibn al-Qayyim, he talks about this. He says, Al-Jahilu yashku Allah ila nas. He says, the ignorant person is the one who complains about Allah to the people. Or rather, Al-Arifu man yashku nasa ila Allah. The one who is truly knowledgeable is the one who complains about the people to Allah. About what he finds from hardship. About the harm that he might hear or feel or experience from the people. He complains about them to Allah Azza wa Jal. I remember there was a scholar who once said, that he was visited by a man who came to him and he says, Ya Sheikh, I need help. And he goes on for about 10 minutes explaining, and we mentioned this before in one of our halaqat, where he says, I complained to the man, he says, the Sheikh, the man complained to me for a good 10 minutes. This happened, and my wife, and my kids, and my job, and all of these things. He says, what is the solution, oh Sheikh? And the Sheikh said, the solution is very simple. Everything that you just told me, and during these 10 minutes, of course, the man breaks down in tears, and is crying, and has problems, and so on and so forth. And he says, in the end, the solution to your problem is very simple. Take all of this, everything that you just did, everything that you just said, and everything that you just did, these tears and this sincerity, and go ahead and pray 2 rak'ahs and do it in your sujood. Because in the end, you're not looking for a solution from me, you're looking for a solution from Allah. He says, I don't have the solution. And he says, why can't you complain like this to Allah? Many people don't. Many people love to complain to another person, but they do not like to complain to Allah Azza wa Jal. When Allah, wallahi, loves it. Allah loves it when we call upon Him. This is why He quotes prophet after prophet, scenario after scenario of people who call upon Him in order for Him to relieve their situation. It's not that Allah does not know what you're going through. He knows. But He wants you to humble yourself in front of Him. He wants you to understand that the solution to your problem is in His hands alone. Because only then will you truly, subhanAllah, achieve proper ubudiyyah. Proper ubudiyyah is what we want to achieve. Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he has a whole book about trying to achieve ubudiyyah. Trying to achieve this servitude to Allah. And one of the elements of this is to only when we realize that we humble ourselves completely in front of Allah, can we properly achieve ubudiyyah. And so this is why it is very foolish to not only stop complaining to Allah, but then to complain about Allah to the people. So going back to Ibn al-Qayyim when he says, Al-Jahilu man yashku Allah ila nas. And he says, وَهَذَا غَايَةُ الْجَهْلِ بِالْمَشْكُ وَالْمَشْكُ إِلَيْهِ. Says this is ignorance in who he's complaining about and who he's complaining to. Because he says, لَوْ عَرَفَ رَبَّهُ لَمَا شَكَاهُ. If he truly knows Allah, he will never complain about Allah at all. وَلَوْ عَرَفَ النَّاسِ لَمَا شَكَا إِلَيْهِمْ. And if he truly knows the people, he would never complain to them at all. And this is why he says that one time he met a man, an individual who was complaining about his scenario. And he says, if you truly knew Allah, you will never complain to Allah, because لِأَنَّكَ شَكَوْتَ مَنْ يَرْحَمُكَ. He says, you have complained against the one who will actually indeed have mercy upon you. The one who will have mercy upon you, you're complaining about. So never do this. We will go ahead and again, inshallah ta'ala, and repeat the fact that you can go to the people of experience. Only if you know that they can actually help you. Only if you know if they're a nasaha. if they will give you good nasiha, if they will give you good advice. And this is why ad-din al-nasiha, the religion is actually giving advice. This is why if you have to go and get advice, you complain within limits. And you probably even limit your complaining to where there is no complaining at all, where you go to them strictly for the advice and not for the fact of complaining. This is why there's a whole industry perhaps that's built upon complaining. When people go to therapists, many times the only job of the therapist is to sit there and listen. Where people want someone to just relieve and alleviate whatever's on their chest to this individual. This is why even as an imam, many times I can guarantee you more than half of the time, the job of an imam is to merely listen and not talk when people come with a problem. And this is okay. One of the things that my grandfather taught me, subhanallah, when he would be approached by people and he would tell me, come and sit. And the people would come and they would explain to him what they're going through and their problems and their calamities. The first thing that he would always emphasize is, put your trust in Allah. Meaning, don't think of me as an individual that I have your solution. Many times we don't. More times than not, we actually do not have the solution to the problem. And we tell them, put your trust in Allah. You are there to remind the people to put their trust in Allah Azza wa Jal alone, and to remind them that the solution is always in the hands of Allah Azza wa Jal. And that if you have to go to a person of experience, you go to them, and this is fine. Because otherwise, it would defeat the whole purpose of Allah making some people more experienced than others. This is why the Prophet ﷺ, for example, if a person finds sickness, he goes to a doctor. And the Prophet ﷺ commanded this, where he says, tadawu. He says, go find medication. If we said we took it completely like this, we said, if Allah is the one who has the cure, I don't need to go to a doctor. No, you need to go to a doctor, because the Prophet ﷺ told you to go to the doctor. Because Allah put the cure for you in the hands of the doctor. But you don't go and complain completely to the doctor. You go within limitations and you put your trust in Allah, that only He has the solution for your problem. May Allah Azza wa Jal help us and guide us to this, and assist us to complain only to Him, and to put our trust in Him, and for us to realize that whatever sadness we face is truly just part of the test. And we should also understand that any sadness that we face, or any calamity, or any pain, or any suffering, is only because Allah Azza wa Jal wants to expiate our deeds. May Allah Azza wa Jal expiate all of our deeds and forgive us, and grant us al-afwa wal-afiyah fi dunya wal-akhirah. عباد الله إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت وسلمت وباركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد اللهم أعز الإسلام والمسلمين وأذل الشرك والمشركين أعداءك أعداء الدين ربنا اغفر لنا ذنوبنا وإسرافنا في أمرنا وثبت أقدامنا وانصرنا على القوم الكافرين اللهم لا تدع لنا ذنبا إلا غفرته ولا هما إلا فرجته ولا دينا إلا قضيته ولا حاجة من حوائج الدنيا والآخرة إلا قضيتها وسرتها برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه اللهم إنا نعوذ بك من زوال نعمتك ومن تحول عافيتك ومن فجأة نقمتك ومن جميع سخطك ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار عباد الله إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون اذكروا الله يذكركم ولذكر الله أكبر والله يعلم ما تصنعون